Watch out, the capitalists are working to destroy the middle class. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Program today, Professor Richard Wolff is on the line with us, the Economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work. .info, author of numerous books. His most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. It's also available now as an ebook. democracyatwork.info, rdwolf.com, the website with two F's on Wolf. Prof. Wolff is his Twitter handle with two F's. Professor Wolff, first of all, welcome back. What is the, we just saw the failure of this union, effort down in Alabama with Amazon. What is is there even an economic theory that animates or is used as an excuse or held up? I know trickle-down economics is kind of, discredited, but is there an economic theory that these very, very wealthy people use to justify eliminating the minimum wage, keeping the minimum wage super low, eliminating worker benefits, eliminating union rights, basically all the things that they have been so effective at doing over the last 40 years since the Reagan Revolution to gut the American working class, the middle class, and even to keep, poor people more and more desperately poor. What possible justification do they have? Is there some bizarre economic theory here that I'm unfamiliar with?
No, I think what's bedeviling you, as it has for so many, is an internal contradiction of capitalism that I can explain really quickly. Marx taught this, and he was right, and we're living with it still. But capitalism has the following peculiar quality. On the one hand, every capitalist understands that in order to profit, in order to prosper, and in order to grow, you have to have the ability to sell whatever product you produce. You have to have a market. There has to be demand. At the same time, every capitalist tries very hard to improve his or her profits by limiting, controlling, or reducing what are called euphemistically labor costs. What this means is every capitalist tries to lower the wages he or she has to pay by gutting the minimum wage, by all the mechanisms of automation and everything you pointed to. As if they didn't understand that if you're successful in reducing the number of workers or in lowering their wages, you are therefore undercutting their ability to buy what you sell. What you do in one way contradicts what you need in the other way. If you're going to have a market, you got to pay them well. But if you pay them well, you won't make the profit you used to. If you don't pay them well, you won't have the market. Capitalism bounces back and forward between this contradiction all through its history. Sometimes, like in the 1930s, the mass of workers rise up and say, stop it, we're not going to be a ball that bounces between misery and an only temporary adequacy of our income. We demand better wage. That's when the minimum wage was passed for the first time in the 1930s. That's when we had Social Security, unemployment compensation, a federal jobs program, all of that. And the working class then got the kind of conditions capitalism had never given. And that was a middle class that was formed then and in that way. And the irony was that the capitalist class opposed it ruthlessly at every turn, but they lost. But then they showed genius. Having lost the effort to block a middle class from really emerging because they don't want to pay them, they then turned around and took credit for it. For the whole rest of the 20th century, people boasted, look at capitalism in America, it created a middle class. No, the middle class was created against it, but they were clever to take credit. Now capitalism can't afford it anymore. We've undone the New Deal. We're back to a much harsher capitalism that keeps bouncing people in the way that I described. And so it's no longer possible to celebrate a middle class because you've eviscerated it. And so conservatives carefully avoid going anywhere near that middle class conversation because the capitalism they celebrate and endorse has no room for that middle class, as it didn't before the 1930s either.
Back in the day, back in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, I did international relief work on 4 continents, and was in a number of countries that were desperately poor and had a small, very, very wealthy class. And I had this conversation with a number of people. It seems that in many of these countries that there was this a very, very wealthy class at the top, everybody at the bottom, and then just a very tiny middle class that was basically the professional class, the doctors and lawyers and whatnot, who were what you and I would call middle class. And I actually recall a relief worker who was also an economist, a guy who had given up economics and gone into relief work. And he was telling me that that's actually the norm. That, you know, if you look at like hundreds of years of European history, the middle class was the professional class that Scrooge in A Christmas Carol was middle class. He wasn't the rich. He was just a middle class guy. He was a small businessman with 1 employee. And that what America did with this middle class and what Europe has done with a large middle class is largely as a result of unionism is a complete aberration from the norm of capitalism. And now we're hearing, I'm reading in The Economist, about this so-called K-shaped recovery, that businesses are starting to resegment themselves, that you've got like literally dollar stores that are becoming food places for people. And then you've got other businesses that are saying, you know, like Apple, for example, we're not even going to bother with somebody who can't buy a phone for less than $1,000. And that it's this, and are we moving toward that? Is that the norm, that the middle class really just becomes the professional class and becomes, you know, a 3 or 5% piece of the society rather than what we thought, you know, the 50, 60% of society?
I'm afraid the answer is yes, and that it's particularly painful here in the United States because corporations are more and more deciding that they don't need to pander to the mass of the American people. And as that mass becomes poorer because of automation, because of moving production out of the country, they set their sights more on where markets are still growing, which is not inside the United States, but in places like China and India. And there the middle class is also very small, but because they are enormous populations, it's the place to be if a business wants to be where the market is growing. And that means the United States is being abandoned by capitalism, just as Detroit was abandoned by the capitalism of the big auto manufacturers, or Maine was abandoned by the lumber and paper companies up there, and so on, when profits were greener somewhere else. But I would compensate that argument or counter that argument with another one. The genie was let out of the bottle by the 1930s, by the union spurts at that time, the CIO, as you rightly say, and a middle class was forced onto the capitalists. It's one thing in those poor societies that have been that way for centuries. It's a very different situation in a society that has tasted and understood what a large middle class can be and what it is. To take that away from a middle that has enjoyed it is a much more contentious and difficult undertaking. And to me, it is not at all clear that American capitalism will be able to pull that off.
That's the stuff of revolution, isn't it?
That's right, exactly.